Good day, scholars. We will today examine Social Studies U.S. History Standard 22. It is analyze the U.S. international and domestic policies, including their influences on technological advancements and social changes during the Nixon, Ford, and Carter administrations. Substandard A, analyze the uh, international policies and actions taken as a response to the Cold War, including opening of and establishment of diplomatic relationships with China, the end of U.S. involvement in Vietnam, the War Powers Act, the Camp David Accord, and Carter's response to the 1979 Iran Revolution and hostage crisis. Opening of China. Uh, China became a communist country in 1949. The U.S. did not recognize it. President Nixon, wanting to create better relationship with China because, of course, it would benefit the U.S., traveled to China in 1972, becoming the first uh, president to travel to the communist country. He hoped by creating better trade relationships with China, he could encourage better relations with the Soviet Union. The end of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. October 1972, the U.S. and Vietnam tried to come to terms with a peace settlement. Nixon was reelected in 1972, and North Vietnam refused to sign the peace treaty. American pulled out of the war, but the war continued in Vietnam. Of course, the war was very expensive and caused huge losses of American life. The War Powers Act. Americans lost trust in their leaders. They passed the War Powers Act was passed in 1973, and it restricted the president's war-making powers by requiring him to consult with Congress within 48 hours of committing American forces to a foreign conflict. Congressional attempt to stop the growth of This was a congressional attempt to stop the growth of um, the growth of presidential power and moving forward. All right, here you can see the political cartoon in President Nixon's hand. His War Powers bill passed. In the caption below, you can see, imagine Congress trying to curb my right to conduct unconstitutional war. Why? That's unconstitutional. So you can see how they are putting a limit to presidential powers, especially after the Vietnam War, with two presidents in Johnson, who started the war and continued the war, and Nixon, who continued the war, even though he said initially that he would not continue the war. Vietnam was a big mess, and nobody wanted to be in a mess like that again. And so moving forward. All right. Camp David Accords in 1979. Um, President Carter helped to broker a peace agreement between Israel and Egypt, two Middle Eastern countries which had been bitter enemies. Israel is a Jewish country. Egypt is an Arab nation. The peace treaty was known as the Camp David Accord. Um, to understand this, you must understand that these are two that is a region that has been long, even now, war torn between with religious wars, basically, um, with the Arab nations, especially Egypt and Iraq, Iran, regions of that nature, countries of that nature, really are predominantly Muslim or practiced Islam. And of course, the Jewish nation practiced Judaism. So, although they are one of the three Abrahamic religion along with Christianity, they um, they constantly fight over what both religions considered the Holy Land, which is what we now know as um, Israel. But initially, before um, World War II, Israel was really an Arab uh, country. But that's a before it was Israeli country. But that's another um, whole mess of history in and of itself. Moving forward, um, the Carter administration and the crisis in Iran. Iran had long been supported by the U.S. Due to it being a major oil supplier, and because it was a buffer against Russian expansion. Excuse me. Iran was headed by the Shah, who was becoming unpopular due to the westernization of Iran. Um, in 1979, Islamic extremists headed by the Ayatollah uh, Khomeini forced the Shah to flee the country and took control. The Shah, who was ill, was allowed to receive medical treatment in the U.S. In response, revolutionaries stormed the U.S. Embassy and took 52 American hostages. Unable to negotiate their release, Carter ordered a secret rescue attempt. The rescue attempt went terribly wrong when a U.S. helicopter and plane collided, killing 8 soldiers and during a dust storm. The failed attempt made Carter look bad and would eventually lead to him losing the election in 1980. The hostages were finally released on Carter's last day in office after being held for 444 days. So that's well over a year. But keep in mind, there are some other things that aided in Carter's loss in the election. Inflation was extremely high because of that situation. Gas was extremely high because you got to understand oil help makes gas, and um, uh, Carter actually tried to convert to the metric system as well, and that didn't go well. That did not go well. So there was many different issues that plagued President Carter during his presidency. All right. B, connect major domestic issues to their social effects during the creation of the Environmental Policy Agency. The emergence of the National Organization for Women, Nixon's resignation due to the Watergate scandal, and his pardon by President Ford. The Environmental Protection Agency. Um, Silent Spring, a 1962 book about pesticides by Rachel Carson, exposed the dangers to the environment. This book led to the Water Quality Act of 1965. The first Earth Day was celebrated in 1970. This raised awareness of environmental issues. In 1970, President Nixon created the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, to set limits on pollution. National Organization for Women. The National Organization for Women now was founded in 1966 to promote equal rights and opportunities for American women. Now has its origins in the civil rights and anti-war movements of the early 1960s. Now's goals include equality in employment, political and social equality, and the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment. All right, Watergate. Oh, Watergate is an interesting event in history. In 1972, President Nixon began his re-election campaign. Fearing that various political issues might cause him to lose, some of Nixon's campaign staff began spying on his opponent. In June 1972, 5 men linked to Nixon campaign were arrested, breaking into the Democratic Party headquarters in the Watergate Hotel. The 2 men were attempting to steal campaign information and tap the phones. Nixon began to cover up any connections between his staff and the break-in, ordering the CIA to stop the FBI's investigation. Now, what doomed Nixon was, well, the president the president denied any wrongdoing and eventually won re-election. But by June of 1973, it was revealed that Nixon had installed a tapping system in the Oval Office to record conversations that he had hoped to use to write a book after he left office. Um, Nixon refused to turn the tapes over to prosecutors uh, investigating the break-in, but was eventually ordered to turn them over by the Supreme Court in 1974. With clear evidence of a presidential cover-up on the tapes, the House began discussions to impeach Nixon. And in August of 1974, Nixon resigned the presidency, leaving Ford his vice presidency, president in campaign. Now, Nixon really personally didn't have, as far as we know, didn't have anything to do with the break-in. But what it led to his resignation or his threat of impeachment was the fact that he tried to cover up what his staffers did. Had he not covered up what his staffers did, he would have he wouldn't have been uh, he wouldn't have been impeached. But eh, he made it a little worse than what it was, worse than what it really was. So that's it for this particular standard. All right, that's it for this particular standard. All right, young people, scholars, I will talk to you later.